I love it.
What's up, guys? John O'Neill here, Cressey Sports Performance. I'm here with Christian Wonders, our pitching coordinators, the owner of the pitching business with Inside CSP. I've been shooting a series of shorter, 1 minute or less videos made for Instagram. The topic I wanted to cover today is a lot longer, so we figured we'd just make it into kind of this informal video blog, podcast. I'm not really sure what it is. Not really sure if it'll develop into something more in the future, but we're just going to bounce ideas off each other for a little while, and we're going to talk about 3 different types of pitchers and how that's going to scale our training, our warm-ups, and our throwing. And I'm going to ask him some questions I don't know the answer to or that I've never asked him before, just to see what happens. But one of the more common assessment questions or more important assessment questions that I'll ask to our starting pitchers is, what kind of pitcher are you in terms of, do you have success, innings 1 through 7 or innings 1 through 9 the same? Are you a guy who starts out hot out of the gate and then tails off, or are you a guy who takes a little while to get going and it's 3rd, 4th inning before you really feel loose and comfortable on the mound? So that to me means a bunch of different things on a training level. I'm going to ask Christian some questions on what that means on a throwing level. But first off, when I hear someone is good innings 1 through 7 or all the way through the game, that to me is like the strength coach's dream, because then all you have to do is basically improve physiological outputs, make them stronger, make them faster, continue to allow them to grow, because there's nothing major that you have to address from a building up capacity level or nothing major you have to address in terms of what they're doing with their warm-ups if they're doing stuff incorrectly, because clearly they've established a routine that allows them to do that. The top line is the guy who comes hot out of the gate and then tails off. That can mean a number of different things. But as a strength coach, that to me means we have to build them up a little bit. We have to not only get them more fit to do that, but we also maybe have to get them stronger. We have to figure out what their holes are that allow them to output the level that they're capable of for a more or longer period of time. And then the third one, I usually think this has something to do with whatever joint assessments or whatever mobility screens we're going to take them through after. Either they're really stiff or they're really loose. So if a guy's really stiff to me, that's a guy who's going to take a few innings or it will take longer to get loose. Or if a guy is really lax or really loose jointed, that's a guy who might take a few innings just to be able to find some good stability. So it's on us to teach that guy what kind of warm-ups to be doing, or to provide a little more strength and stability to him so that he can access those positions that he needs to achieve earlier in the game. So I'm just going to ask Christian some questions about how it influences the guys he coaches. And so we'll start off at the top. So the red line guy who comes out, guns blazing, all of a sudden kind of tails off as the game goes on. What does that mean to you as a pitching coach?
Well, it could mean a couple of different things. So, like, the first thing you can think about, this red line in professional baseball could be like a reliever. So, like a max effort guy, max intensity guy. But from an amateur baseball standpoint, it could mean that a guy has inefficient movements down the mound. So, he could be like one of those, he could be a max effort guy, he could have inefficient lower half, so not creating tension from the lower half to help create rotational power, and he has a lot of body English, I guess you could say, coming down the mound, and isn't able to use his lower half to deliver his arm.
You mentioned like mechanical efficiency. Is the guy who's kind of flatline or stays the same, and maybe it's really good, maybe it's not, the same innings 1 through 7, is that the guy most likely to be mechanically efficient? It makes sense if they were.
Yeah, absolutely. Just because you think about starting pitchers in the major leagues, those guys are 92, 94 all game long, most of them, and those are the guys that just look easy. People talk about like effortless deliveries. Well, effortless deliveries are like starting pitchers essentially, but what a lot of people don't realize is effortless deliveries are driven from a lot of effort from the lower half. So it looks like their upper half is very effortless, but that's because their lower half is driving their delivery. So I like to say that your lower half's your engine, your upper half's just along for the ride, or kind of like a 90-10 split. So that's kind of what I see from what I would think of with the guy that's kind of tapers off towards the end. He just gets really fatigued because he has a lot of this inefficient movement, or it might be inefficient mechanics where like he's putting more stress on his arm and he's not able to throw the baseball as much. Or it could be a guy that maybe just didn't follow a off-season throwing, like a good off-season throwing program where he didn't build his work capacity. You know, you think about the kids up in New England who start third Monday in March. I typically start them like January 1st on a throwing program, and then I have them throw long toss for 4 weeks before they even think about stepping on a mound. And like it's become my rule for them to carry a baseball 180 feet at least for a week, and not throw a baseball 180 feet. It's carry a baseball 180 feet. So that's very subjective, and you have to have the eye to be able to see that. But essentially, carrying a baseball 180 feet and being able to backspin it for a week, in my eyes, is sufficient enough for them to get on the mound.
I look at that as almost like, I mean, everything we do is trying to create analogies from strength training to sport training to throwing a baseball, and you do the same in terms of good joint position, stuff like that. But it's almost like the blanket, all right, you need to just throw a baseball. Like I can throw a baseball 200 feet right now.
Right.
I couldn't get anybody out at any level right now. But it's like us saying, all right, you have to be able to deadlift, 315 before you do something else. Well, what does the deadlift look like?
Right.
Like I can walk up to any bar with 315 on it, probably round back my way through it. Right. But unless I'm warmed up, that's not going to happen. And it's a matter of like technical efficiency, which is where like a good sport coach comes into play.
Yeah, and it's almost like you have to earn throwing off the mound with me. Like, you have to throw consistently. You can't miss throwing sessions. Like, the guy that throws once a week, like, I'm not going to put him on the mound. You know, his arm's not conditioned to throw off of the mound. Like, you think about it from like a strength training perspective, if your max deadlift is 300 pounds and you take 3 months off, then you train once a week, like you're not going to get back to that weight. That's the same thing. It's like you got to build your arm and condition your arm to be able to handle that stress of delivering a baseball off the mound. But from like a performance standpoint, carrying a baseball 180 feet and able to using your lower half, because you have to use your lower half and drive late arm speed to be able to backspin a ball 180 feet. And the kids have to understand that and learn how to do that before they hop on the mound. So that way they're not trying to create velocity elsewhere when they're hopping on the bump.
That makes sense. So it's kind of like tying two ends together. Like using like the strength training example, like if you take a while off, like you might be able to walk up to a previous max and maybe get it or come pretty close, but you're not going to be able to sustain it for like 3, 4, 5 sets.
Right.
And so that, to me, sounds very similar to this guy who maybe has his velocity somehow, but unless he actually built up his arm to be able to handle that velocity that he's capable of, he's going to tail off pretty quickly. And this chart doesn't necessarily refer to, at least to me, you can correct me, but it doesn't necessarily refer to just velocity, it's just success in general. So like the y-axis, I purposely put success instead of velocity because you might have your velo in inning 1, but have no idea where it's going.
Yeah.
Or you're a guy who has it the whole game, like Redline guy might have it the whole game, but he can locate it early and then fatigue sets in and he has no idea where it's going.
100%.
So.
And I mean, everybody's like caught up on velocity right now. Velocity is pretty important, but when it comes to game situations, like you have to get hitters out. That's the name of the game. Like velocity at that point means, it's going to be, if you throw harder, you're going to be able to miss more and stuff like that. And if you can drive more arm speed, then your off-speed pitches are going to be better. But when it comes to game situations, it's throwing strikes and getting hitters out.
It's funny you say that. Like I look at my job right now as like I'm 2 feet in the door in the strength and conditioning community, but my eyes are always watching the baseball community. It's kind of like the way I look at it. And in our community, strength and conditioning, you would never, if it's heavy deadlift day, you would never say, all right, you need to be at this weight, or we're gonna hammer and nail drive you into this weight. No, we're just gonna try to execute the task, right? And so the baseball community, instead of like you're talking about like executing the task and spending your off season or your training building your velocity, it's all right. We're gonna try to build our velocity in season with this program or this magic tool or whatnot, and that doesn't work in the training world, and there's no reason that it should work, at least not over a sustained period in the baseball world.
100%. 100% agree.
So, talked a little bit about like stiff and loose guys earlier. I want to kind of get back to that before I forget to ask these questions. So that's, to me, is usually like the green line guy.
Okay.
Especially at a younger level. He's the kid who has no idea how to warm up on his own.
Okay.
And does whatever the team gives him, and maybe he's a guy who doesn't need to stretch at all, but he's doing a whole like stretching series, and it takes him some level of fatigue just to find any kind of stability to get outs, right? So if you have a really loose guy and their range of motion theoretically is like this, right, and they need it to be this to get somebody out, unless they can maintain this while stabilizing this, it's going to be like this until they get tired and it gets lower, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So how do you, like I know you've coached on field before, if you know you have a pitcher like that, how would you influence his pregame throwing?
Well,
not necessarily just a loose or stiff guy, but somebody who you know struggles out of the gate.
Right, so it starts with finding what everyone needs from an individual standpoint. The status quo in the baseball industry is jog out to center field, stand in a circle, do a couple of cross body stretches, do one of these, spread their feet, do some hamstring stretches, come in and do a couple of butt kicks and sprints. Like, that's definitely not sufficient enough as a warm up, but we're talking about pitchers here, which is a very specialized movement. Everybody needs something. Everybody's going to need individual drills to do. So my thought behind it is like, all right, have your own 5 or 6, and then get together as a team and do a dynamic warm up. And then from a pitching, like a pregame standpoint, he can do, the pitcher can do his individual drills by himself in his pregame routine. So I'm fortunate enough to have a strength training background where I can put together those routines for those guys. But from a throwing standpoint, it might be that you have the guy throw a little bit more long toss to get a little bit more loose. It could mean that you throw a couple more pitches in the bullpen. It could mean you throw to a couple of simulated hitters in the bullpen at game speed. I always say there's no such thing as game speed except game speed, because there's nothing like a hitter stepping in the box.
It's true though, from like a tension and arousal perspective, you can't recreate that. You can come close,
right?
But I mean, no matter what you do in here, no matter what we do in the weight room, like unless somebody has actually faced hitters and been in a game regularly, it's still going to be new, and no matter, like, physiological measures could all be great, but performance isn't going to be unless someone has that experience.
Yeah, and you can't simulate that no matter what. Like, I can't even begin to tell you how many games I've pitched in my life, and till the last start that I ever made, I still had butterflies in the bullpen until I got that first guy out, or through like the first strike. So that could be another thing too. Like there are guys that have that like competitive anxiety where it's like they hop on the mound the first time in the first inning and they might struggle because they're a little bit anxious, or they're not settled in yet. So that could be a reason why one of those guys starts off slow. I know for me it was, if I ever had trouble, it was always in the first inning. Always in the first inning. But as soon as I got through the first inning, I knew I was good to go.
Part of that is like that psychological component you're talking about, but just from being a big baseball fan and following the statistics and stuff like that, the inning where the most runs are scored at the major league level is the first inning.
Right.
And the answer, or the reason is pretty simple. I mean, it's the only inning where the other team has their hitters in order. And they have the leadoff guy who you have to try to get out, and it's probably a pain in the butt if he gets on base.
Right.
Right. The number 2 hitter might be the best hitter on the team. Then you have your 3, 4, 5 guys, and so it might take you 4 or 5 hitters to get 3 outs. But then you come out second inning, and all of a sudden you're facing weaker hitters.
Yep.
And it's consistently like that for the rest of the game, unless you have an inning where the leadoff man makes the last out, and then you have 2, 3, 4. But chances are that the best lineup is going to be in the first inning for them.
Absolutely.
So, you mentioned one thing I want to trace back to, because I've actually never heard you say this, or I've never had this thought before, but you're talking about long toss and how you might extend that a little more for certain guys just to loosen them up. Would you say that you would necessarily scale that or change that based on how stiff or loose someone would present on like on a table and a range of motion testing?
I don't think so. I think it would just come from personal preference.
Sure.
However, if I do see the guy that, most of the guys that I work with, I get to see them on a weekly basis, so I start to learn what they like and how they perform at their best. And if somebody's throwing aggressive long toss all off season, and then they decide like, okay, the season rolls around, I'm just going to throw the baseball to 90 feet before my starts, and then you see this green line trend, and it's like, all right, well, you got to stretch it out a little bit before you hop on the mound. Like, you've been doing that all off season. Let's try it out and see what happens. But it's definitely personal preference, and you definitely don't want to fatigue the arm, and throw a bunch of long toss before a baseball game. But like, guys like to, a lot of guys like to stretch it out and feel that like backspin, kind of like what I was talking about before they hop on the mound. So I don't necessarily think I would scale it to like hypermobile or stiff. I think it would just be like personal preference, or me getting to know them and understanding how they perform at their best, and then just communicating that to them.
Well, that makes sense. Part of the long toss example is brings up a really good point that's directly related to training. Like, we train these kids or these guys all off season, and we build up every level that we can, right? Or whatever they need in terms of strength, speed, somewhere in the middle. But if they don't actually keep up with it on their own in season, or keep up with some of it, they're basically just going to fall off that bar. Like, we rose the bar, and so, but they're going to just start falling off unless they hit at least bare minimum they need to. And so I've never really thought of that from a throwing perspective, which is a really good point that you brought up, that there are a lot of teams and coaches who don't let their guys go beyond 120 feet and who never actually do anything aggressive, bullpen work and stuff like that. But like, it's anything in the weight room, like if you want to stay strong, you have to occasionally exhibit your strength.
Right. I agree.
Going back before, you mentioned like off-season throwing program stuff. So like, one of my main questions, like the premise of this whole thing, for starting pitchers in a weight room assessment is, all right, who are you? Like, who are you? Top line guy? Are you middle? Or are you bottom line guy? So how would those questions affect your thought process in terms of designing an off-season throwing program?
All right, so we're looking at the guy who is maybe at top here. I could end up, so I mentioned earlier that I start most high schoolers on January 1st, but it could be that guy just doesn't have the reps. Like, he might have thrown 5 innings the prior year and just became a pitcher. So maybe you start him around Thanksgiving and give him 5 extra weeks of throwing and long toss and 5 extra weeks of bullpen. So maybe he goes into the season with better work capacity, the ability to be able, like the conditioned arm to be able to throw that many pitches in a game, or so it could be that. I think that would be like the biggest thing is like starting a guy earlier to get more reps in who maybe didn't get enough repetitions in the prior year.
So like I'm somewhat familiar with it, but I've never actually done it. I know like most people in my industry are not. Like, what's a typical shutdown period? How long and how does that vary based on the individual?
8 to 12 weeks.
Okay.
And it changes with the climate as well. In Florida, you're trying to get 8 weeks for those guys, but it's kind of hard. You got to shut them down early in October, November, start them up, around Thanksgiving or December, because their season starts February. Now, it used to start in January, but I think this year they changed it to starting February 1st. But I know from like a research standpoint that they say that in order to see ligamentous change, you got to shut down for like 10 weeks, I think it is. Don't quote me on that. But so I try to get, with the pro guys, 10 weeks, with the high schoolers 8 to 12, and that can depend on amount of innings. So let's say a guy throws 100 innings as a 15-year-old, which you don't want to do. I try to shut him down for like 3 months, like 12 weeks, maybe even longer, and get him on a serious strength and conditioning program, and just educate them that it's probably not a good idea to throw 100 innings as a 15-year-old. But
it's funny you mention that, because that's actually, like, our industry we learn a ton about, or the industry is trying to learn a ton about different assessment tools and different schools of thought, and they all work in the right context, right? Or if performed correctly, or if you're actually assessing what you think you're assessing. But like in our community, it's crucial that we ask kids, like, all right, how much did you actually throw last year? Because if the kid's going to throw 120, 140 innings as a 15-year-old, there's not a whole lot we can do for him to keep him healthy. Right? We can delay things, but at the end of the day, the most physically stressful thing that he's going to do on his body, he's doing too much of. Right?
And I always say, like, do you want to be the best 14-year-old pitcher every single weekend, or do you want to actually pitch when it matters, like in a D1 school or in college, paying for an education and actually competing for real championships, not just weekend gold medals that on Monday morning when you go to school you actually forget about. It's like, it's educating the parents on that as well. Like, do you want to see your kid pitch in college, or do you want to see him in a brace with a scar on his elbow at 17 years old?
Yeah. Hey guys, sorry about that. A little technical failure on our end. Camera shut off. We're going to cover just one more question. We were coming close to running out of time anyway. The one thing I was going to say to add on to what you were saying about getting kids going earlier in the off season and making sure they have a structured throwing program, a lot of the time I don't see the issue as always being, the kid threw too much. That one's obvious. Like, the industry has made it a case where, everything is so heavily regulated, but every kid's different. Every kid has a different background. So I look at it almost like an oil change in a car. So let's say you get an oil change every 3,000 miles. One way to not get an oil change is to drive the car less, right? And as opposed to, creating a better engine and keeping up with maintenance on the car, all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of what we do in the weight room and in the gym, is like we're building better engines so that they can handle the stress that they need to handle on the mound.
100%.
Not too much, but just the fact where they should be able to throw in a 100-pitch game and, come back 5, 6, 7 days later and do that for a season and not break down, right?
I like that.
So last question here we're going to cover. We talked a lot about kind of that top red line, the bottom green line. So you've been an on-field coach before. When I see somebody like that in the weight room, in terms of they take a while before they can achieve high-level performance, that to me means we just need to pick the right warm-up exercises, right? Pick the right things, maybe extended dynamic warm-up, get med ball throws and jumps in, and make sure that we're doing all that stuff before the person is actually lifting anything heavy. What would you do on field, knowing that you have a kid or you have a guy who takes a while before they're good in the game?
It could be figuring out what drives them, what motivates them. It could be, like I said, throwing more pitches in a bullpen, but also figuring out personality, like whether or not they have like some competitive anxiety, and teach them how to deal with that. And, once they get through that first inning, they should be on the right path. But it's definitely on an individual basis, and I think it comes down to knowing your athletes really well and kind of what makes them tick.
So I know I said one more question, but this is kind of an add-on with this. Part of our job, knowing that our kids, are going to be gone for 2, 3, 4 months, or gone for the most part, as opposed to being here 4 to 6 days a week, is making sure they're knowing what they're doing on their own, right? And making sure that they're still getting the lifts in and all that stuff, so that they don't totally fall off that bar that we set for them. Do you do kind of the same thing with your pitchers in terms of, all right, these are drills that are important, and this is what you need to work on, and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I try to give every pitcher that I work with like 2 or 3 things that 2 or 3 big rocks that they need to think about. So every one of them is going to have a little bit of a different thing that they have to think about in order for them to make their mechanical change, if that's what you want to call it. But it's all results based, right? So or feel based. I want them to either see a result and be able to make the adjustment on the next pitch, or I want them to be able to feel it and be able to make the adjustment on the next pitch.
Right.
But yeah, they all get 2 to 3 big rock thoughts that they need to remember throughout the season. I kind of just hammer it home to them when they leave here.
Yeah, that makes sense. I try to do the same thing too. I mean, I think it's on us as an industry to make sure that we're giving kids, hey, here's what we worked on all off season. Here's what you need to continue to work on when you're in season on your own. Whether it's, if you can get in here a couple times during the week all season, that's awesome. It's not always practical, but the important thing is that they're not just losing all the progress that we made with them, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We want them to stay sharp, both, most importantly on the mound. But unless they're staying sharp in the weight room, they're not going to be able to stay as sharp on the mound.
I agree.
I guess that last statement kind of sums up what we talked about as a whole, and why we strongly believe in what we're doing in terms of communicating as a strength coach to a pitching coach, and a pitching coach to a strength coach. And we're just, put simply, 2 guys trying to make the baseball community better as a whole, and trying to help out whoever we can, cross paths with us. Yep. So this could be the first of many, video blog, podcast, whatever it is. I hope you guys took away at least one thing from it, and be happy to answer any questions after that. Thanks.